This is absolutely incredible. Look at how they perfectly outlined the Virgin Mary.
A man who built his own business with bees, a grandfather who passed away while guarding a secret about his hives, and a phenomenon that science cannot explain, but that changed everything. This is the story of Marcus Webb, and of the miracle of the Virgin Mary that happened when he least expected it. But before we continue, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. I would love to see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary are reaching. You know, that type of person who has an answer for everything, the one who looks at the world and sees only logic, cause and effect, scientific explanations for every mystery. Marcus Webb was that kind of person, 52 years old. Gray hair he kept cut too short because he didn't have the patience for a barbershop. Rough hands from working outdoors every day. Light blue eyes that looked at things with an almost irritating intensity. He didn't believe in coincidences. He didn't believe in luck. And he definitely didn't believe in miracles. Marcus had an apiary in Oregon, 50 hives spread across 5 acres of land he had bought 10 years earlier. It was a solid business. It didn't make him rich, but it paid the bills. He knew his bees. He could tell when a colony was thriving by the sound it made. He could sense when something was wrong by the way the bees moved at the entrance of the hive. 10 years doing this. 10 years building something from scratch, proving to himself and to the world that he didn't need help from anyone, especially not from his grandfather. Because just 20 minutes away, on a much larger property, Marcus's grandfather ran his own apiary. Joseph Webb was 87 years old and still personally tended to 200 hives spread across 15 acres. The relationship between them was complicated. Joseph was a devout Catholic, Mass every Sunday, rosary every night. A statue of the Virgin Mary in his home. Marcus had grown up with all of that, but abandoned it at 18 when he went to college to study biology. Superstition, Marcus used to say whenever his grandfather tried to talk about faith. Joseph would only shake his head and smile that smile older people give when they know something you'll only understand later. When Marcus decided to become a beekeeper, Joseph offered a partnership. "We can work together. I'll teach you everything I know." But Marcus refused. "Thanks, but I'd rather do things my own way." That had hurt Joseph. Marcus knew it, but he needed to prove that he could succeed on his own without depending on his grandfather. For 10 years, they ran separate apiaries. Marcus visited Joseph occasionally, tense Christmas dinners, quick birthday phone calls. But there was always that distance, that unspoken thing between them. And then, in March of 2023, Joseph passed away. A sudden heart attack. One day he was checking his hives, the next day he was gone. The funeral was small. Joseph didn't have many living relatives. Marcus was there, of course. A few neighbors. The priest from the local church who spoke about faith and devotion and a life well lived. Marcus didn't cry. He stood there looking at the casket, feeling a strange mix of loss and guilt and something he couldn't fully name. The will was simple. Joseph left everything to Marcus, the house, the land, the 200 hives, all the equipment, the entire operation. Suddenly, Marcus had to manage not only his 50 hives, but 250. It was 3 times the work, 3 times the responsibility. In the first days after the funeral, Marcus had so much work that he could barely process the loss. His grandfather's contracts to fulfill, honey to harvest, clients waiting for deliveries. There was no time for proper mourning. It was Daniel, the employee who had worked with Joseph for 15 years, who kept everything running while Marcus tried to organize the chaos of inheriting an entire business. "Your grandfather had everything very well documented," Daniel said, showing notebooks filled with Joseph's shaky handwriting. He wrote everything down, every hive, every treatment, every problem. Marcus flipped through the notebooks. It was impressive, truly. The level of detail, the care, the dedication Joseph had poured into this for decades. But then he saw something that made him stop. On almost every page, Joseph had made small notes in the margins. Specific dates marked with a tiny cross. And beside them, frames placed, or images renewed, or protection of the Virgin Mary. Marcus closed the notebook sharply. It was on a hot April afternoon that Marcus decided to clean out the main shed on his grandfather's property. The place was crammed with decades of tools, old equipment, boxes stacked to the ceiling. It smelled of old wood, beeswax, and that undefinable odor places acquire when they've been closed for too long. Daniel was helping, separating what could still be used from what needed to be thrown away. Marcus was moving boxes from a corner when one of them opened, spilling its contents onto the concrete floor with a dry thud. They were small frames, dozens of them, simple wooden borders, each holding an image of the Virgin Mary carved in wood. Marcus picked up one of the frames, turning it over in his hands. The image was beautiful, he had to admit. The Virgin Mary with her hands extended, the blue mantle, that serene expression religious artists always managed to capture. Joseph's frames, Daniel said behind him, his voice soft. Marcus looked at the employee. You knew about this? Of course. Your grandfather placed them in every hive. Every spring he renewed them. He said it protected the bees. Marcus let out a dry laugh. Protected them. Right. There was a notebook under the frames in the box. Marcus picked it up and immediately recognized his grandfather's handwriting, firmer than in the recent notebooks. He began to read. It was a sort of journal, detailed instructions on how to place the frames inside the hives. Joseph wrote about how his own father had taught him the practice, how important it was for the bees' health, how it brought protection to the colony. Marcus read page after page, and each line irritated him more. Here was his grandfather, a man who had run a successful apiary for 50 years, sincerely believing that small frames with images of the Virgin Mary made any difference to insects, creatures operating purely on instinct and pheromones, creatures that had no concept of religion, faith, or the Virgin Mary. Daniel, Marcus said, closing the notebook, do you really believe this makes any difference? Daniel hesitated. I don't know if it makes a difference or not. All I know is that your grandfather swore it did, and his hives were always the healthiest I've seen in 30 years working with bees. Correlation is not causation, Marcus replied automatically. My grandfather's hives were healthy because he was an exceptional beekeeper. Daniel didn't answer. He just looked at Marcus with that expression Marcus was starting to recognize. Silent disapproval. Marcus grabbed the box with all the frames and carried it to the farthest corner of the shed where Joseph kept broken equipment waiting to be repaired or discarded. He tossed the box there without ceremony, raising a cloud of dust that sparkled in the light coming through the gaps in the walls. Sorry, Grandpa, Marcus said aloud, but this is ridiculous. Months went by. Marcus worked 16 hours a day, trying to manage both apiaries. It was exhausting. But he was stubborn enough to make it work. May arrived with its intermittent rains. June brought the heat that made the bees work at their absolute peak. July was a frenzy of production, harvesting, processing. Marcus was so busy he barely thought about his grandfather, the frames, or anything beyond the constant work. It was on a July morning in the apiary that had belonged to his grandfather that the problem began. Hive number 47, one of the oldest. Marcus was doing his inspection round when he noticed something wrong. The bees at the entrance were far too agitated. Chaotic movement, some of them fighting each other. He opened the hive carefully. What he saw made him frown. The combs were damaged. Not by disease or parasites, but as if the structure had been, disturbed, broken. One of the inner frames where the bees built their combs was completely loose, hanging at the wrong angle, making it impossible for the bees to work properly. damn, Marcus muttered. He needed to fix it immediately, or he would lose the entire colony. He had to stabilize the damaged frame, give the bees a solid structure so they could rebuild their combs. But he was in the middle of the apiary, far from the main shed where he kept his materials, and the situation was far too urgent to postpone. Marcus looked around, searching for anything that could work temporarily. His eyes landed on the old shed about 50 meters away. The shed was just as he had left it months earlier. The box with the frames of the Virgin Mary was still in the corner, covered by a thin layer of dust and a few cobwebs. Marcus grabbed one of the frames. It was rigid enough, approximately the right size. It would work perfectly as a temporary support until he could make a proper repair. "Sorry, Gramps," he said ironically, wiping the dust off the frame with his shirt sleeve. "I'm going to use your superstition for something practical." Back at Hive 47, Marcus positioned the frame carefully among the damaged combs. The wooden border fit perfectly, giving the hive the support structure it needed. The image of the Virgin Mary faced inward, as if she were watching the bees work. "Just temporary," he murmured to himself. But then July brought an unexpected heat wave. After that, an important client needed an urgent delivery that demanded all his attention. Marcus was so overwhelmed managing 2 apiaries that he simply forgot about the Virgin Mary frame left temporarily inside Hive 47. August arrived. The intense summer heat gave way to milder temperatures. The bees began preparing for autumn, reducing production, storing honey for the winter ahead. It was on a Tuesday morning, the first week of September, that Marcus finally returned to perform a full inspection of Hive 47. He remembered the temporary fix only as he was lifting the lid. "Oh, damn the frame," he thought. He expected to have to remove it carefully, maybe damaging some of the bees' work, but nothing serious. What he saw made him stop completely. The bees had built their combs, perfect layers of hexagonal wax, shining golden under the September morning light. But the way they had built them, the frame with the image of the Virgin Mary was completely enveloped in wax. The combs had been built around it, embracing the wooden frame from all sides, integrating it entirely into the hive structure. But the face of the Virgin Mary was completely uncovered, a perfect circle of cleanliness amid the chaos of the hive. Marcus blinked several times, certain he was seeing it wrong. He tilted his head, changed the angle of the light, but there was no mistake. The bees had built wax around the entire image. But they had left a perfectly clean area, completely free of wax, exactly where the face of the Virgin Mary was. It was as if they had carefully avoided covering that specific part. The wax formed a kind of natural frame around the face, but it did not touch it. Not a single piece of wax had been built over the eyes, the nose, the mouth of the image. It was impossible. Marcus had worked with bees for 10 years. He knew their behavior. They built combs, following the space available. They did not avoid specific areas in such an intentional way, so precise. He carefully removed the frame from the hive, held it in his hands, turning it, examining it from every angle under the sunlight. The construction was perfect. The precision was too impossible to be accidental, and that was when Marcus felt it, the smell of roses, strong, unmistakable, fragrant, real. It wasn't a subtle scent he could question. It was intense, present, surrounding everything around him. Marcus looked around quickly. He was in the middle of his grandfather's apiary. There was clover, wildflowers, some plants the bees visited, but roses. There were no roses there. There were no rose bushes anywhere on the property. His heart began to beat faster. The hands holding the frame trembled slightly. This isn't, he began to say out loud, but the words wouldn't come. The smell of roses was everywhere. In the air around him, as if coming from every direction, and from none at the same time. Marcus closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was the honey. Maybe some nearby tree he didn't recognize. Maybe some chemical product Daniel had used. But he knew. Deep down, a part of him that desperately tried to deny it knew. There was no explanation. When he opened his eyes again, he looked directly at the image of the Virgin Mary. The serene face left uncovered by the bees in an impossible way, seeming to look back at him. For a moment, Marcus couldn't move. He stood there, holding that frame, surrounded by a rose fragrance that shouldn't exist, looking at a pattern of honeycomb construction that defied everything he knew about biology and animal behavior. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the smell vanished. Marcus blinked. The air was normal again. Only the usual scent of beeswax and warm wood under the sun. He placed the frame back into the hive with hands that still trembled, closed the lid carefully, stepped back a few paces, needing distance, needing space to think. He tried to form an explanation out loud, but he couldn't finish a single sentence. Marcus returned to his truck and sat there for 10 minutes, just staring at Hive 47, trying to process what he had just witnessed. In the following days, Marcus couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. He tried to rationalize while working, tried to find explanations while driving between the two apiaries, tried to apply logic and science to the phenomenon. Perhaps the bees had built according to some feature of the frame he hadn't noticed. Perhaps there was some specific chemical residue on the image that bees instinctively avoided, but doubt corroded him inside like acid. On Friday of that week, Marcus made a decision. He was going to test his theory. He was going to prove to himself that nothing supernatural was happening, that there was a perfectly rational explanation for everything. He went to his own house and searched through drawers until he found what he needed, an old photograph printed on stiff photo paper. It was approximately the same size as the frame of the Virgin Mary. On Saturday morning, Marcus went to Hive 47 and carefully removed the frame with the image of the Virgin Mary. In its place, he put the ordinary photograph, positioning it exactly the same way, at the same angle, in the same spot inside the hive. "Let's see," he murmured, closing the hive. "Let's see if the bees do the same thing with any picture, or if it really is something about..." 3 weeks passed. Marcus forced himself not to check every day, to give the bees enough time to work, to build enough so that the pattern would be clear. They were 3 weeks of constant anxiety. Marcus worked, tended the hives, processed honey, but part of his mind was always on Hive 47, imagining what he would find when he finally opened it. When the day he had marked on his calendar finally arrived, Marcus drove to his grandfather's apiary with his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He opened Hive 47 with slow movements, almost afraid of what he was going to find. The ordinary photo was completely covered with wax. Completely. The bees had built over it without hesitation, without avoiding any specific area. The wax covered the entire surface of the photo, fully integrating it into the structure of the comb. It was exactly what Marcus would expect to happen with any foreign object placed inside a hive. Exactly what should have happened with the image of the Virgin Mary. But it hadn't happened. In November, winter arrived early in Oregon. Temperatures dropped drastically, and that was when the entire apiary began to have serious problems. 4 hives developed severe mite infestations. 3 others showed signs of weakening with no apparent cause. An entire colony died during an especially cold night, leaving behind only empty combs. Marcus was desperate. He applied every treatment he knew. He consulted specialists. He tried different medications. Nothing worked consistently. It was as if the hives were vulnerable, weak in a way he couldn't understand. At his own apiary, the 50 hives were fine, healthy, strong, preparing properly for winter. But the 200 hives that had belonged to his grandfather were in steady decline. It was Daniel who finally said what he had been thinking for weeks. It was a December afternoon. they were in the shed, checking stock of medications and equipment for the sick hives. Marcus was frustrated, exhausted, no longer knowing what to do. "Your grandfather always put the images," Daniel said suddenly, breaking the silence. Marcus stopped what he was doing and slowly turned. "What?" "The images of the Virgin Mary. Joseph always placed them in all the hives at the beginning of fall, every year without fail. He said they protected the bees during winter, that they kept the colonies strong." Marcus felt irritation creep up his spine. "Daniel, you really think pieces of wood with religious images—" "I don't know what I think," Daniel interrupted, and there was something firm in his voice that Marcus rarely heard. "All I know is that Joseph did this for 50 years, and in 50 years he rarely lost colonies in winter. His bees were always the strongest, the healthiest in the region. Everyone knew that. Correlation is not... It's not causation, I know." Daniel finished the sentence. "You've already told me that." "But Marcus, look around. Look at what's happening. You did everything right, applied all the correct treatments, followed every scientific protocol, and you're losing hives." Marcus didn't respond. He stood there, listening to the wind howl outside, making the old shed walls creak. "They're withering, and the only real difference is that your grandfather used to do something you're not doing." Marcus looked at the employee for a long moment. Then, without saying anything, he walked to the corner of the shed where he had thrown the box with the images months earlier. The box was still there, dusty, forgotten. He opened it. Dozens of images of the Virgin Mary stared back at him from the dim light of the shed. "This is ridiculous," he said out loud, but his voice lacked conviction. He picked up the box, looked at the images. At the serene, identical, mass-produced depictions that his grandfather had kept so carefully for so many years. He thought of the impossible pattern he had seen in Hive 47, of the smell of roses that shouldn't exist, of the test that proved something inexplicable was happening. And he thought of his grandfather's colonies dying under his care, despite all his science, all his knowledge, all his protocols. "Screw it," Marcus muttered. That afternoon, he began placing the images in the hives. He started with the 5 that were in the worst condition, the ones he thought he would lose anyway. If he was going to lose them, at least he could say he had tried everything. He opened each beehive carefully. He found a suitable space between the combs. He positioned the frame with the image of the Virgin Mary, vaguely remembering the instructions he had read in his grandfather's notebook months earlier. He did it with his hands trembling slightly, feeling ridiculous. He closed each hive after placing the frame inside. He expected nothing. He didn't believe it would make any difference. But a small part of him, a part he tried to ignore, whispered, "What if?" A week later, those 5 hives showed improvement. The bees were a little more active. The signs of disease seemed to have stabilized. The colony looked stronger. It could have been coincidence. It could have been that the medical treatments were finally taking effect. It could have been a natural shift in the colony's cycle. It could have been many things. But Marcus added frames to 10 more hives. 2 weeks later, those also showed improvement. The colonies were stabilizing. The decline had stopped. In January, with snow covering the apiary and winter at full strength, all 200 hives that had belonged to his grandfather had images of the Virgin Mary installed following the instructions in Joseph's notebook, and the apiary stabilized. The losses stopped. The colonies not only survived the harsh winter, but began to grow stronger. Marcus didn't know what to think. He couldn't admit, not even to himself, that something supernatural was happening. But he also couldn't deny the results he was seeing with his own eyes. He tried to find explanations. Maybe the wood of the frames released some compound that affected the bees positively. Maybe it was simply that he was paying more attention to the hives now, checking them more often. Maybe. But deep down, a part of him that grew every day knew those explanations were weak. Months passed. Winter slowly gave way to spring. In March, exactly 1 year after his grandfather's death, the snow began to melt, and the first signs of new life began to appear. The bees emerged from the hives, strong, healthy, ready for another working season. The 200 hives that had belonged to Joseph had survived the winter with minimal losses. In fact, they were among the healthiest colonies Marcus had ever seen. Marcus kept his grandfather's tradition. Every autumn, before winter arrived, he checked each hive and renewed the frames when necessary. Every year, he placed the images of the Virgin Mary following the instructions in Joseph's notebook. He never had another experience like that first one in Hive 47. He never again smelled roses. He never again saw another pattern of construction as specific and impossible as that one. But that first frame remained as a testimony carefully stored in the shed, a permanent reminder of a September morning when everything he thought he knew about the world was questioned. Marcus did not become religious. He did not start going to Mass or praying the rosary like his grandfather did. He did not come to believe in miracles in the traditional, unquestioning way that people of faith often do. But something changed in him. When he placed the frames in the hives each autumn, he no longer did it with irony or desperation. He did it with respect, with care, with a humility he did not have before. He finally understood what his grandfather had been trying to teach him all those years. That acknowledging mystery was not the same as abandoning science. It was embracing the fullness of what it means to be human, capable of reason and logic, but also capable of wonder and humility before the inexplicable. The hives thrived under his care. Both apiaries, his original 50 hives, and his grandfather's 200, became known in the region for the exceptional health of their colonies. When other beekeepers asked his secret, Marcus answered honestly, "I learned from my grandfather, and he taught me that sometimes the best science is the one that leaves room for what we don't yet understand." And sometimes, when he was alone in the apiary at dusk, with the constant sound of bees working around him and the golden light of sunset bathing the hives, Marcus looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you, Grandpa. I think I finally understand." Before we finish, I want to invite you to become part of our prayer community for the Virgin Mary, a place of faith and hope where people from all around the world come together to pray and share the graces they have received. If you feel in your heart the desire to join this chain of prayer, click below and become a member of the channel today, and come pray with us. And if you made it this far, to the very end of Marcus's story, do one thing for me. Write the word roses in the comments. The fragrance that came from nowhere when a man discovered that 10 years of beekeeping could not explain everything. I want to see how many hearts this story truly reached. And every time I read roses in the comments, I will know that one more person believes that miracles of the Virgin Mary still happen. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to renew their hope today. May the Virgin Mary continue blessing and protecting you and your family. Amen.